All right, so today's episode is the third part of our 5-part series on leadership mind traps. Nate and I have been unpacking what author, coach, and consultant Jennifer Garvey Berger calls these leadership mind traps, and she discusses in her most recent book, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps. So mind traps are where the evolution of our brain has essentially not caught up with the complexity of today's world, the world that we lead in. It's how the brain's natural reactions can hurt us, how they make us less effective. If you haven't already, you can scroll back through the episodes of this podcast and listen to our two previous episodes on mind traps, where we discussed first being trapped by simple stories and secondly being trapped by rightness. In today's episode, we're going to be unpacking how we can be trapped by agreement. So we're all guilty of this as leaders in some shape or form. Probably the most common way is that we want to be liked. So we fail to give feedback, or we fail to challenge people, or we fail to hold people accountable. That's with our players, our staff, our colleagues, even our bosses. We want to be liked. We want everyone to get along, and we don't like conflict in groups. This is the mind trap of the brain, and it comes from that need throughout time for groups, our need for groups to survive. And so we want the group to get along, and we want for ourselves to feel a part of the group, to feel safe in the group. Now, as important as that is, it has some ways of hindering our effectiveness as leaders. We don't give hard feedback, and we're afraid to engage in hard conversations, as well as a few other things that Nate and I are going to unpack in this episode. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. In addition to this podcast, I'm a leadership coach and a culture consultant. To learn more about how my business TOC can support you and your organization, go to tocculture.com. This episode is brought to you by the TOC newsletter. Every Thursday, you get a short email with some food for thought from Nate or the Leadership 311, which are 3 thoughts, 1 tip, and 1 question on a leadership or culture topic. If you sign up for the newsletter, you also get the notes to each episode of the podcast, and you get our top 10 podcast episodes and top 10 articles of all time. You can subscribe using the link in the details of this episode, or just go to tocculture.com and click on newsletter.
One of the phrases that I've come across frequently in leadership circles here recently, JP, is this idea of working with like-minded people. We know what it feels like to be on a staff or to be part of a team or to be working in a department where everybody seems to be pulling in the same direction. We feel unified. We feel like there's harmony and everybody's in agreement with the way forward. And certainly that can be a unique situation. It's not always like that, but there's something inside of us where when we get to that place of agreement, we feel like this is definitely the right way forward. And what's interesting about that experience and how much we are reinforced, how good it feels to be in agreement with others, is author Jennifer Garvey Berger actually identifies that as another one of the mindset traps that can keep us from being productive, being effective, being efficient, and finding better ways forward when it comes to our decision making. Now, when we think about how our brains have been wired over thousands of years of evolution, if we go back 100,000 years, JP, if you and I were living on the savannah together with our families, it would be important for us to be able to live in harmony, because if we couldn't, if I did something to offend you, to upset you, and you ostracize me from the village, I'm not going to be able to survive on my own. I'm not going to be able to survive away from the group. And so it became this survival mechanism to want to be able to live in these smaller groups, these smaller tribes, but to live in harmony because, quite frankly, we needed each other to be able to hunt and gather and be able to survive out on the prairie or wherever it might be. What's interesting about that leadership tendency today is that we can chase the feeling of agreement and stop there. And it prevents us from finding other ways, better ways forward.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it feels good to agree, right? Like it's a good thing to have that agreement, and it's painful to disagree, to be kind of disconnected from the group. In fact, Berger in the book goes into some of the studies and research around social pain, right? When you feel like you've been rejected, from a girlfriend or from someone in your team, and you feel left out, that social pain, that disconnection from the group actually shows up in the brain in the exact same way as physical pain, to the point that you can take a Tylenol or aspirin and it's going to relieve some of that social emotional pain in the same way that it relieves the physical pain. And so when we think about our role as leaders and the type of culture that we're trying to create, okay, obviously we want to have agreement. And so if this disagreement, this disharmony in the group can sometimes get us to compromise some of our decision making, right? To give in to other people in ways from our assistants to our players to up the chain of command, and kind of go against maybe sometimes our something that's really important to us, our core values or even core beliefs, or just ways that decisions that we've thought through that we think, hey, this is the right way to go forward. Well, we could sacrifice some of those decisions. We see this all the time from leaders because they want harmony, right? They're choosing harmony in that moment over what they believe to be right in that situation. At the same time, you see the culture that we create as leaders can create a culture where people are trapped by that agreement, where people don't want to disagree with us. They don't want to give us feedback. They don't want to speak up around some sort of tactical decision or the way we're teaching something within our offense or our defense, or they don't want to. I look back at my journey as a coach, and there was so many times that I know that my assistant coaches saw certain behaviors by me that were not consistent with my values and the intent and the impact that I was trying to have on my players, but they didn't feel safe to speak up, to disagree with me, right? Because they valued harmony in that group. And also because they probably saw that I was pretty trapped by, my perspectives, and I was pretty stubborn at certain points and wouldn't have been open to their challenging. I wouldn't have been open to them challenging my ideas. So I think when we look at this mind trap, it creates a lot of problems, not just for us, but it can create problems for our culture with our players and with our staff.
I think as I've gotten older as a coach, JP, I've starting to realize how limited my own vision or my own ability to perceive decisions from different perspectives actually is. And so I've sort of been on this journey. We've talked about this on some of our recent episodes of really trying to open up, to rethink my sense of rightness about some of my decisions, and to try to incorporate other people into conversations about how we do all kinds of things, right? Coaching in our program. And I think what I run into here is what you just described as people are naturally, our players, assistant coaches, even probably most parents are naturally going to simply agree with my line of thinking. So even though I'm trying to question a little bit some of my assumptions about what we're doing, I find it hard to get actual reflection from others on where I might be missing something or where I might be wrong in ways that I could then hopefully find an even better solution. I'll give you a couple examples, JP, of where I've seen this recently. So I was sitting in a head coaches meeting just in our department, 17 head coaches here at Mount Vernon, and we were trying to have an open conversation about, are we asking too much from our players in terms of in-season and out-of-season commitment, what's optional, what's not optional, etc. Well, in the meeting itself, there wasn't a lot of feedback. There wasn't a lot of conversation or discussion. A couple people shared a couple of things. Nobody really pushed back. The AD kind of looked around and we just moved on. But after the meeting, there was all kinds of individual conversation about the topic, about, yes, I think other programs maybe are asking too much, maybe we're asking too much, et cetera. The problem is none of those opinions ever got into the mainstream. Those opinions were never discussed out in the open where they could be reflected on by others. And so the meeting itself was completely unproductive. And if I'm looking at that from a leadership perspective, it's completely the opposite of what I want, right? Like, I've started an interesting conversation. I just don't get to be part of it because everybody's having it off to the side out of their fear of disagreeing or challenging others in the actual meeting itself. And therefore, nothing changes, right? And nothing gets done. I can think of another example. Just the other day, I was meeting with our seniors in kind of a preseason meeting and had a checklist of things that I wanted to run through with them. And, again, I'm trying to be open to more perspectives here. And so I was asking them a question about our practices this year and some of the benefits and some of the challenges of having just 14 kids together in practice. And after I asked the question in that sort of open-ended way, it was crickets, JP. There just wasn't a lot of response from them. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think number one, because I held my cards back, they're kind of thinking, well, I know coach has ideas and I know there are things that he's already thought about. And so to them, maybe it feels like they're trying to guess what I'm thinking. It's not what I want. I'm not looking for pre-affirmation in terms of my thoughts. I'm really looking for objective perspective on our challenges here that I haven't thought about from a player's perspective. Now, I could have gone about this conversation in a different way and laid out my bullet points of the challenges and the benefits that we've come up with as a staff and just said, all right, seniors, tell me what you think. In both cases, I've made this conversation hard for them. On the one hand, they don't know what they're walking into. I've been thinking about it for 9 months. I asked them the question. They think about it for 2 minutes and they're trying to come up with something. On the other hand, if I lay out all of my thoughts, they're predisposed to wanting to agree. Yeah, coach, that sounds good. Yeah, coach, that makes sense. And then that's the end of the conversation as well. So this, JP, is where I've really been challenged of how do we create an environment in a meeting or in a conversation to gather some of this feedback or some perspective that I just struggle to find on my own.
Well, you think about how maybe we've trained our athletes, our staff members, our team members, or maybe just society and the world has trained them, but people are trained to believe that the way they earn trust and the way that they earn respect is by agreeing with us, right? We see agreeability as a virtue. Oh, that person, they're just good. They get along with everybody, right? Like how many times do we say that about people? Oh, we love that person. They get along with everybody. And yet we need people that are willing to speak up. But yet when we look at the system upon which we operate, our system around our leadership and the decisions that we have to make, I mean, we're hiring people that played for us, right? Because they think like us, they were taught like us. We promote people, we affirm the people that don't question our decisions and don't challenge us in front of the group and the team so often. And so what we do is we're training this mentality where, hey, don't challenge coach, or don't go too far out there. That might be too much for them to handle. And I think it kind of connects to that trapped by rightness thing that, Jennifer Garvey Berger, we first have to probably sometimes escape that as a leader and be open to the fact that we could be wrong, to then start to encourage this environment and this culture where people can feel safe to disagree with us. Because if we're trapped in rightness and people come up and they challenge our perspective on something or give us feedback that might be challenging our leadership, and we have this strong emotional reaction to it, they're not going to feel safe to continue to present ideas that go against what we're sharing. And so it's, how do we start to build trust that, not, hey, I'm going to have your back and you're going to have my back no matter what I decide, but trust in the sense that if I'm the coach, that I trust that you're going to share with me what's really on your mind. And then you can trust that I am going to be open to that. And I'm going to consider that. And I'm going to listen to that. And I'm not going to take it personally. But that trust only is built up over time with how we're responding and how we're also asking questions, like the things that you're talking about there. Yeah, I think it's a process. It's not just a one moment type of thing that happens that instantly builds that trust where you can feel safe to disagree.
Well, if I was going to play devil's advocate here, I can imagine some coaches pushing back a little bit and saying, but don't I need my staff to be in alignment? Don't we need to be out on the court with a common approach to offense or defense or how we're going to interact with players? I can't put something in with an assistant coach behind me telling another kid this is bullshit and it's never going to work. So where is this line, JP, between wanting to foster disagreement and conversation, and yet when we're out on the floor and we're coaching, needing to be in agreement and unity as a staff?
Well, I think it's important to first get really clear that at the end of the day, if I'm hiring a staff, I really want some alignment of some core values, right? I'm looking for some shared beliefs around how we should treat people, around integrity, respect for each other. There's some basic core values that we want alignment, but I don't want like total alignment in opinions or ways of thinking. And I would say that's even just about me and you on this podcast. I think we have a very shared values when it comes to coaching and leadership, but we have very unique ways of approaching different things, and being able to share those openly discuss those, bring them to the forefront, like in our conversations, is really valuable, right? But at the same time, there has to be some moment where someone makes a decision and you disagree, but you're still committing to that action. And I think this, I'm not going to have one magical solution or silver bullet for coaches that struggle with this. Absolutely not. There's a lot of gray in this, right? When you look at some of the greatest organizations and teams, they have heated debates. You'll read the books like the Culture Code, and they talk about the Navy SEALs, putting in a mission plan, or Pixar. Or you talk about the San Antonio Spurs. You talk about all these organizations. They have heated debates, but in that conflict, it focuses and remains task conflict. They're disagreeing around ideas. It's not personal conflict, not relational conflict. And so when you how it's probably more so important that we focus on the rules of engagement, the rules of disagreement here, than it is about, okay, where's this line and what point do I have, ultimate authority and power to make this final decision? Okay. It's more about how do we engage in this conversation, and then how are we going to walk away? And as Berger talks about, it's not always walking away and compromising. Right? At the end of the day, sometimes you may decide you have to choose one thing or the other, right? But either way, I would be more focused on what's our rules of engagement? What's our rules for how we are going to interact and disagree here?
Well, one of the analogies that comes to my mind as you're talking there, JP, is kind of the difference between sparring and fighting. If you think about a swordsman that's going to be in training for battle, they're going to spar with their fellow soldiers on their side, right, in their training. So they're going back and forth and they're trying to hone their skills. But then when they take the battlefield, they are fighting alongside one another against their opponent. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what I've been trying to explore here is how do I create a space like that with my players, with my captains, with my coaches, with our administration, even to be able to sit down and say, all right, here's an idea, here's a challenge, here's an obstacle, here's a decision that I've got to make, or that I'm thinking about making this decision in this particular direction. Now, what do you think? Let's spar a little bit around the idea, as you said. Don't stab me, okay? Let's spar around the idea. And then hopefully that helps to be able to hone our skill or hone our outcomes there so that we can all walk out of the room and face our opponent on Tuesday or Friday night with a better way forward. And I think philosophically, that's easy to understand. I think when it comes to boots on the ground and how do we actually do that, it becomes very challenging. It almost feels like we're kind of trying to thread a needle here.
And I think this is what's so important in this sparring you're talking about. To fully understand, and appreciate, and get behind some decisions that we make as leaders, I think our people need to at least feel heard, and they need to really hear our perspective. Let's take the example, just playing time. And we've talked about this in a previous episode, but one of my favorite activities to do with teams is the playing time case study activity. You present a case scenario of like, hey, player A, gets injured, player B takes their spot in the starting lineup. Player A gets healthy, but player B was playing really well. Who starts, right? Things like this, real life challenging circumstances you present them to the players. The players have to have a discussion. Oftentimes in that discussion, there's disagreement. At the end of that day, some players may not agree to the policy or the way that you go about it. But I think at least laying these things out and allowing people to disagree, to feel heard, and then for you to share your perspective in that process, whatever is decided, whether we agree player A is going to be on that and all the players are on board with that, or we agree player B is the one that's going to continue to keep playing. Either way, I think we can be a little bit more committed to the decisions that we're making and moving forward in that by just creating this sparring, this space to do this and safely, articulate where we might disagree. And I think at the end of the day, too, it's so critical that we're not the one that's always winning that sparring contest, right? If they step in the ring with you and they're going day after day and they do it through sparring and it's just still at the end of the day, well, whatever coach says, like he's really not going to change his mind on it, then people will start to lose that trust. You've got to be open to trying out some other ways than just what we always believe is the right way. So we have to escape that trap by rightness. And if we're doing that, we're going to be trying out some different things that people might throw and suggest.
Well, another interesting aspect of what Berger talks about in the book is kind of the other side of getting some of this feedback or disagreement, which is we tend to, when pushed upon, become entrenched. We become polarized. We dig ourselves in and we become defensive about our idea rather than being able to learn more from the perspective of others. And so there is a balancing act here between wanting to encourage more conversation without it going into a place where it's just one side versus the other in an argument or a disagreement where there is no common ground, there are no open ideas or openness to another idea, because that can be just as frustrating as not having anyone say anything at all.
So all this begs the question of like, how do we escape this trap ourselves as a leader, and how do we make sure that our people, our team members, don't fall into this trap of agreement? I think there's kind of when where we have an idea, maybe like in your example there of like, should we have JV and varsity practice together, or maybe it's a tactical decision, or it's a consequence for some misbehavior on the team, like a player steps out of line, or like anything that maybe we want to get the opinion of others on their take on something. I think there's kind of two ways to go about it. One is to do what you did, which is to allow them to go first and say, hey, we have this issue or this thing that we're considering. What do you think? Now, I think the best way that we can do that is sometimes, if possible, to give them a heads up and say, hey, tomorrow or later today, I want to talk to you about this. I'm just curious your thoughts and your takes on it because, we're sitting here wrestling, trying to figure this out. I think the other way is to say, you know what? I put a lot of thought into this. I'm going to present them the game plan, the battle plan. I'm going to present it to them. But then I'm going to say, hey, this plan is got holes in it, right? Help me see the holes. Where do you see this not going well? Where do you see this becoming a problem for our people? I obviously have my perspective, but I can't have your perspective. And I value it so much. And I think those are kind of two ways to go about it. One is allowing them to kind of come in there and share their thoughts, and we don't want our opinions to cloud their opinions, right? And the other one is just, hey, share this, but ask them to challenge them to share their perspective and be open and vulnerable to the fact that your plan isn't bulletproof.
I think one of the challenges here, JP, is trying to figure out what is the right question to ask to elicit the feedback that's going to help me the most. In other words, when I walk into this meeting with our seniors and I just ask this open-ended question, did not give it to them ahead of time, expecting them to think on their feet and give me some very clear and concise, aha moment that I had missed myself, that's probably asking a lot. Or another example, a couple of years ago, we were looking to add some full court pressure to our defensive systems. I could walk into the team room and say, how do you guys think we should pressure in the backcourt? And just leave it wide open. Now, not a lot of them have a lot of basketball experience, so they're probably not going through the menu of all the different zone presses and man presses and different wrinkles that I would be aware of as a head coach for 20 years. So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to get the best feedback, right? So instead, in that particular situation where I think I did it well, we put three possibilities on the board. And we said, if we did A, here's what we would need to do. Here's what we could get out of it. Here's where we're vulnerable. If we did B, if we did C, the same thing. Now, tell me what you think. Which of these three ways forward would you be most comfortable with learning, executing, and hopefully getting something out of? So in that case, I'm sort of laying out the menu. I've done a little bit of the legwork myself, but still, again, opening it up to here's three different ideas. What do you guys think between these three possible options here?
So I really appreciate, this whole asking questions to try to gather other people's perspective. This is going to sound maybe like too simple, but one of the biggest issues that I see in myself when I ask questions and other leaders is that we actually don't give people space to think about it. I wonder in that conversation with those athletes today around combining JV and varsity, I wonder when you ask that question, how long did we sit in silence for? How long did we brainstorm ideas? Do we create that space? Sometimes it might take a minute or 2 minutes or more of silence. And I remember Kim Scott in her book, Radical Candor, she talks about different ways of structuring meetings where just coming into the meeting, presenting a challenge they're facing, and asking people to write down different ideas. What are some different solutions? What different thoughts do you have on that different perspective? Then spending the first 5 or 10 minutes of that meeting just with people in silence together thinking. And then they start to go around and share in the room. So just can we create space? Can we create silence? And in that silence, in that space, then people's ideas might just start come forward. And sometimes it takes, someone 30 seconds, 2 minutes to get the courage to say, well, actually, coach, I think this here, knowing that you may disagree.
That also reminds me of a strategy that Annie Duke talks about in her book, Thinking in Bets, to try to get more articulate feedback, is just asking other people in the room or other people on your staff to play a role. In other words, let's say, JP, we make a decision about the starting lineup. And I go around and we ask, all right, if you were writing an opinion piece for the newspaper that was going to be critical of this decision after the game, what do you think you'd be writing about? Or if you and I are going back and forth about, you think we should be in man press, I think we should be in zone press, and we're kind of at loggerheads here, we might pause and say, all right, I want you to switch positions. So Nate, I want you to give the best argument for what JP wants. JP, you're going to now defend my side, just to see it from a different perspective. We've done this with our assistant coaches. Tell me why this won't work. Tell me what a middle school kid might think of this decision, and just putting them in a place, almost like it's kind of like a role play in the sense that it permits them now, as the critic, as the person that's writing the article, as the person that's defending the other side, to be a little bit more open. Well, if this is what I was doing, then yes, I would say that was a stupid lineup change, coach, because you took all your big players out, whatever it might be. So that's one way that we've started to experiment a little bit, is just giving them a role, a make-believe thought exercise here, and asking them, because I do think it unlocks them, their courage to be able to maybe say some of those things that they might be thinking, but not yet saying.
Yeah, as we're talking about courage, it probably makes me think right now of the area that I think that we really haven't really discussed in this episode yet. But when it comes to being trapped by agreement and how this holds us back the most as leaders, and that is giving people hard feedback and having hard, difficult conversations. We want everyone to get along. We don't like this idea of conflict. And so, I remember simple things. I've had coaches over the years where a staff member has their phone out during practice, and they're afraid to challenge them, to say, hey, like that's not okay, right? Like, we struggle to give players feedback around certain things. We struggle to step in and maybe even give some hard feedback to a parent that's behaving in a way at the games that's not helpful to their son or their daughter, and it's not helpful to the environment that you're trying to create. And so, how do we have courage in those moments to give that feedback, that knowing that it might lead to, they might disagree with us, right? That might lead to some disagreement. I love Jennifer Garvey Berger's question in the book, which is, could this conflict serve to deepen the relationship? Could this conflict serve to deepen the relationship? And I would say most of the times, if we can do this in the right way, in a healthy way, it absolutely can serve and deepen the relationship. And in fact, our failing to engage sometimes in sharing what we're observing and sharing our perspective while being open to their perspective, if we fail to do that, then how really deep is the relationship? Right? How really much do we value these people? How much do we really care about these people if we see something that's potentially harming them and harming others, and we're unwilling to share? And so I think we have to come back to that question. Hey, how could this conflict serve to deepen the relationship? Anytime we feel that sense of, hey, I don't want to challenge this person, I don't want to share my perspective because they could disagree with me and they could get really upset about that. And I wonder, and I look back on my coaching journey, and man, I just wish that I had created an environment where more people felt safe to speak up to me or to challenge me, or just people had more courage to step in and give me feedback about the way that I was leading and the effect that it was having on other people.
Once again, JP, I think what you're describing there goes all the way back to what you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about the importance of trust, right? And that it isn't one conversation where an assistant coach or a player comes with feedback that's designed to help you as a leader, but it's how we respond to that, how we invite that, how we validate that, how we, in many ways, make ourselves vulnerable to that, that allows them to build that trust so that it can become a healthy part of the relationship. And I think that trust piece is so important as well. Now, for the coaches out there that are wondering, all right, we get this disagreement, we start having more vibrant conversations here, but what about when we have to walk out of the room and take the floor? Like, how do we get this healthy disagreement and yet be able to walk out in a functional commitment to moving forward in some direction or another? Well, I think the first thing that's most important is to understand there's more than one way to walk out of that room. And by that room, I mean where the discussion and the debate has occurred. It could be the expectation of the coaching staff, this coming from you as a leader, that we want to, again, engage in conversation. But when we walk out the door, when we're in front of players or when we're on the street and parents, talk to us and ask us questions about strategy, that we are unified in the decision that comes from our time here. And I think that is an important standard for coaching staffs to commit themselves to. But there are some decisions that don't always lend themselves to just one way or the other. There are times where it's a little more open-ended. For example, if we go back to our example with full court pressure defense, we might actually walk out of there and say, you know what, let's try man and let's try zone in practice today and take a look at the film and then come back to this, right? So we're committing to exploring a couple of different ideas or different avenues forward in order really to collect more data to better inform the next conversation that we're going to have before we maybe make a commitment one way or the other.
Yeah, it makes me think back to just some of the years where, my team for years was really bad at starting games. And I had a very specific, detailed warm up that I wanted, how we'd warm up for games. But obviously, it wasn't resonating, working. But my mentality was it's just because they're not going hard enough and they're not doing it right. Right. But I had conversations over this one season with my team about our warm up, pregame warm up. And they wanted to go completely the opposite of what I wanted, right? They wanted to kind of do two line layups, something that looked cool, it was relaxing and all that. And we had both kind of explained our perspectives. And we said, let's go for a bit of compromise. And that was the moment we picked a compromise, which was, hey, we're going to do a little bit of my stuff. We're going to do it at a high intensity, high pace. And then the last 5 minutes of the warm up, you're going to get to do what you guys want to do, the little two line layups and a little bit more chill part of the warm up. And what we saw was through that compromise was really buy-in. They bought into what I was asking. And I said, hey, you got the last 5 minutes. And I was okay with that. And that's a situation where I think compromise is effective. Now, there's some things that I would just say that we shouldn't be compromising on. And we shouldn't even potentially commit to the other idea. For instance, if I was to work for a coach today that believed that it was okay to be demeaning to his players or to her players and to yell and scream and to kind of use some of this threatening, aggressive type coaching, honestly, there's a lot of things I'd like to say I could be agreeable and I could get behind a lot of different defenses or offenses or ways of teaching the game. But that's a situation where I might express my disagreement. And if we can't come to an agreement that we're not going to treat people like that anymore, then I'm going to walk away from that situation. Because this comes down to not necessarily a personal opinion, but more my personal values and my beliefs. And so I think coming back to that, just at the end here, it's really important that we know what are our core values and core beliefs, things that we want to hold on to, and what are some other things that we're going to hold lightly as we move forward as coaches.
I think the last thing I would add here, JP, and this is going to sound overly simplistic, but I do think there's value in it, is just explaining to your assistant coaches or your seniors or your players or your captains or whoever you're trying to get feedback from a little bit about our natural tendency to want to agree, and just encouraging them to get outside of their comfort zone a little bit, to have the courage to poke holes in these ideas or give us a contrary opinion, because it's the best way forward, because everybody benefits from that, because there are perspectives out there that I can't always see or appreciate. And I think when we just open ourselves up in that way, we acknowledge that, look, we all want to feel agreement because agreement feels good. But for us to be able to find the best way forward, we have to take a moment here and be uncomfortable with disagreement and just see what emerges. And if you can almost frame it like a thought exercise, like that sparring where we're going to just go at it for a little bit here to try to find the best idea, I think that will engage people in a little bit better way. And then hopefully, as we respond positively to those conversations, that trust is built and it becomes something that enhances our decision-making going forward.
All right, that's it for today's episode. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, or if you watch them on YouTube, you can be sure to hit the subscribe button. Also, if you could, please leave us a review and share this episode with some friends and colleagues.